Hello and welcome to this video on synthetic drugs. Now, to be clear at the start of this video, we are not talking about synthesized drugs, those being drugs that are made in a lab but are derived from a naturally sourced original precursor molecule. In this case, we are talking about drugs that have the effects of illegal drugs but are not the drug in question. For example, a drug that has the effects of cannabis but has no involvement from the cannabis plant whatsoever. In other cases, is the drug from the natural source but heavily modified in some way. Synthesized drugs are good as it ensures a reliable and consistent supply and is not contingent on having the original plant material available. Synthetic drugs are bad as they are often not regulated in any way, shape or form and can often be much more potent than the original drug would be. One of the factors that led to the development of synthetic drugs is that they were not regulated. That is because there was no law about them. Since there was no law, no one could be penalized for distributing them or using them. This rather obviously was a glaring loophole. The loophole was closed in most places between 2010 and 2020 for the most part. There have been a few rare exceptions, but most of those have been well and truly dealt with, legally speaking. For this video, though, we are going to look at a few examples, as this might be a better way to explain what a synthetic drug is, compared to trying to explain all of the possibilities. The first example we have for you are synthetic cannabinoids, basically artificial cannabis products. You may also find these on the street sold as Spice, K2, Bliss, and more. Overall, this is perhaps the biggest group of synthetic drugs out there, largely because they've been investigated for the longest time. Originally, they were developed for legitimate reasons. There was thought that perhaps cannabis or the cannabis products that are useful could be synthesized and made more targeted and purposeful. This hasn't really panned out in any given way, but it has led to some pretty effective classifications and knowledge about what they're up to. You have your classical cannabinoids, you have your non-classical cannabinoids, hybrid cannabinoids, aminoalkylindoles, and eicosanoids. And yes, all of these words are about as hard to write as they are to pronounce. The classical cannabinoids are basically THC, or the active ingredient in cannabis. As a result, structurally they're all fairly predictable and they all have the same fundamental basic structure, a dibenzopyrin ring. This is useful as it gives you an idea as to what can and can't be changed to keep structurally functional cannabis type products, but have them made synthetically. And the other side to that is that if you find structures like this still in a drug, or particularly a synthetic drug as we're talking about them, it's not necessarily because they're functionally necessary. It could be that it's just not practical to change them, and that it takes far more effort and time than it's worth, or that it's just not possible to change them. It will vary considerably based on the drug in question, but these are the sorts of questions that would be asked by someone looking to develop it as a synthetic drug. Your non-classical cannabinoids include a very important central structure, the cyclohexylphenols, and this is pretty much the first thing that's going to be targeted. They're going to look at this central structure and try to figure out what comes off of it, and rather than break the hexagonal structure, can they instead start adding or subtracting from the various arms or side chains that make it up. Next are the hybrid cannabinoids, and these are basically just a hodgepodge mixture of both classical and non-classical cannabinoid structural features. This exists largely to separate out the classical, non-classical, and the next two distinct groups. First are the aminoalkylindoles. These are distinct from THC in that they rely on a lot of new structures being used. These substitute for the various arms or branches of the molecules that you would find in classical and non-classical cannabinoids. They are also the most popular, let's say, and it's largely the fact that the necessary steps to synthesize them and the means of doing so are much easier than both classical and non-classical cannabinoids. As a result, it is something that someone who is less skilled can get away with without having to worry. The final group, the eicosanoids, are from a medical point of view perhaps the most useful but not necessarily the most beneficial in terms of drugs. That's because they are an analog or recreation but with a different formulation of endocannabinoids. Endocannabinoids are cannabinoid-type molecules made within the body that activate the cannabinoid receptors. This means that they are, for lack of a better phrase, naturally occurring within your own body. As a result, the body doesn't or isn't likely to have the same sort of negative reaction to them. You can see here a comparison of the different kinds of molecules we're talking about, where you have the different synthetic options plus the original cannabis type product, THC. Next we have bath salts, and these are an entirely synthetic cathanone. Cathanone, or cathanones in plural, are really weird and thankfully not as easy to make, or at least not as easy to make for pure cathanones. That's because they come out as a enantiomer, that being two different versions of the same molecule but facing different directions. One is the active version that's useful as a synthetic drug, the other isn't. The other consideration is that you need to start with particular molecules or else you're not going to be able to do anything with it. In this case though, it doesn't require as difficult to obtain chemicals as some other drugs would. In this case, it requires alanine, an amino acid. From here, the alanine is chemically processed, and no, we won't say particularly how, but if you're competent, you'll be able to figure it out or find the information yourself, using different chemicals and then metals as a catalyst to change the structure of the alanine. This eventually leads to what should be a practically pure version of the cathanone, and as a result, you are getting effectively the same product, just chemically generated, rather than relying on what is created inside the body. The actions of bath salts are that they are a very strong stimulant, and that's because they act on the same receptors as ephedrine acts on. Ephedrine is a molecule within the human body that's normally generated by the central nervous system. The original ephedrine molecule can be seen here, as can the bath salts equivalent, or cathanone. Next we have for you LSD and the synthetic drug alternatives, which come under the name of DMT, AMT, Blue Mystic, Nexus, and there are more again. There are two possible pathways. For the most part, the biosynthetic pathways are not really used, largely because you do need a lot more time, effort, and resources, and you're not going to get the same kind of yield as you would from laboratory synthesis of it. However, it is worth noting that both can be used, but you are going to have a lot more trouble with one versus the other. Much like with bath salts, this uses an amino acid as the basic thing for it. It goes through the Shikimate pathway, and from this you get the indole alkaloid called dimethyltryptamine. The basic process is that it involves breaking down part of the aromatic amino acid or carbon ring that makes up a large part of this. And by methylating that, you get the ability to catalyze it, and the catalyst allows for the movement of a methyl group. That movement in the methyl group is particularly important. Without that, you're not going to get a lot of the other necessary products coming out of it. The movement of the methyl group is called transmethylation, and this is where you get your two products. Most importantly, we're talking about DMT for this, but the is a secondary product that will also regulate how much is made. For the most part, we're not talking about a huge change in structure. It is largely just the loss of the amine group between the tryptophan into DMT that gives you what you're after. As said, there's a lot more steps involved if you're going to go down the biosynthesis pathway. The laboratory synthesis pathway is both more diverse, and as a result you can basically choose and pick which of the methods is most convenient and practical for you. But the results are very much the same in that what you get is the same basic molecule. Getting to that end result though is a little bit different, where the biosynthetic pathway relies on the use of L-tryptophan, The synthetic pathway in a laboratory uses indole. It is reacted with other chemicals, and as a result of that, you use metals to create the DMT itself. And yes, we have just tried to consolidate a lot of information into just a couple of steps, and that is almost exclusively so that we don't run afoul of the YouTube censors. Another pathway relies entirely upon tryptamine and the ability to chemically treat it to get the same result as you would when trying to use tryptophan. There's also other methods that are rather more laborious. The two that we've mentioned, primarily using either tryptophan or tryptamine, are the most commonly used, largely because of their practicalities. The three examples we've given so far all have a few common features. The biggest by far and away is the substitution of one part of the drug. In other cases, slightly larger parts like whole side chains may be swapped out, removed, or otherwise altered. The drug still does what it is meant to do, and in some cases can act even better than the original. This is why synthetic drugs are weird and interesting. They are biologically, functionally the same thing as the original drug. The differences are generally small, but small in chemistry terms makes it possible to recreate them in a lab, basement, or Winnebago if you're trying to play Breaking Bad. It also means that they may still work exactly as the original drug did. But that's the key. The danger with new novel drugs, and especially with new synthetic drugs, is that they may prove unstable, unpredictable, or too effective. Imagine if rather than the relaxation you expect of a cannabinoid, you get so relaxed your heart stops. Extreme psychoactive or stimulants could result in psychoses or death as your heart explodes in your chest cavity. This is where and why the synthetic drug industry, and especially the illegal synthetic drug industry, is incredibly dangerous. It's not necessarily that the drugs themselves are anything new. It's that they can be so much more than what the original was, and as a result, they can be far more dangerous. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.